Now, let's have some comments from our Evolving London lecturers, if I may put it that way. We're going to begin, if we may, with Will Hutton. Will, the question I want to pitch to you is, remind us, if you will, of what were the priorities in your Evolving London lecture about the knowledge economy, and what is the investment needed in London as you see it from that lens, and how can that be achieved?
Okay. Well, the first thing to say is that, well, great to be here. London is the knowledge economy capital of Europe. It is a super cluster. And if you look globally, economic vitality globally is coming from mega cities. London and the southeast is a really, along with Berlin and maybe Milan, the only contender in Europe to kind of fight back or represent or capture the trends that are driving that globally. So, that's one of the reasons why it's growing faster than the UK average, and will continue to do so. I think it's worthwhile. There's a lot to say about the origins of this knowledge economy. Most of the employment, 60% of Londoners work in knowledge economy jobs, broadly defined. That's astonishingly high. The figure would be 30 or 40 normally. And it's bigger than actually, of course, the London boroughs. You've got to think of the Heathrow Triangle, a company called Quid, a data analytics company based in California, analysing the innovation startups and follow-throughs around the world, identifies that this kind of Heathrow Triangle as second only to Silicon Valley as a kind of innovative hotspot globally. And there's similar effects up the M11 to Cambridge, down the M23 around Gatwick, and of course the kind of the North London ring of towns like St Albans, Stevenage, Luton. It's astonishing. That's the first thing to say, and we should all know it. It's an ecosystem. That's the second thing I said in my lecture. You've got to think of the interdependencies that are driving this. What I argued was that actually you can't conceive of that happening without knowing that 470 multinationals have their headquarters in London and the southeast, and that together with, of course, the City of London, means that there's kind of more business decision making taking place in this part of Europe than anywhere else. There are only 86 multinationals headquartered in Germany, for example. So we've got more than 5 times than Germany. And the second thing is that is the importance of Heathrow. 75,000 jobs directly related to Heathrow, and actually aviation-intensive business sectors also clustering in London. And I put up a chart showing the degree to which even estate agency and property is a kind of aviation-intensive sector. But other business services are obviously in the same kind of camp. Don't forget supporting this.
Something's gone wrong with the sound. I apologise.
Can you hear me or not? Yeah. Okay, I'm planning on speaking for it. Don't forget 3 other things that support this, actually. Here we are in this Institute of Medicine. Never forget that London is the medical capital of the world. My own university, Oxford, is the leading research kind of centre for medicine in the world. And actually the London teaching hospitals and the research institutes here make this a global centre for medicine. It's also London University, together with Oxford and Cambridge, is unparalleled, even compared to the United States, as a concentration of knowledge, high quality, knowledge intensive tertiary education. And of course there's the cultural and creative industries. Put this together and you have this multiple self-reinforcing virtual circles that drive the dynamism of this area. So 3 do's, 3 don'ts, and I'll stop. 3 don'ts. And first of all, if there was an in-out referendum on membership of the European Union, I'd like to know how this audience would vote. Who would vote to leave the European Union? Please raise your hands. 1. Who would vote to stay in? Please raise your hands. Well, you're all right. It's absolutely obvious, and actually it needs to be said in a world in which UKIP may become first in the European elections and may get not 1 million votes in the general election, which they got in 2010, but north of 2 million votes in the general election in 2015. It needs to be said that the most self-defeating thing this country could do would be to leave the European Union. The number of multinationals that are still coming into the country has begun to decelerate. The number of ones making kind of open noises that they would relocate these headquarters if we left is growing. And actually, it's absolutely essential for this city that we keep this momentum. Secondly, don't fool around with Heathrow. It needs a third and a fourth runway. And I'm very glad to see that the Davis inquiry is actually not talking about moving Heathrow east, but actually we've just got to expand that airport. Many of these headquarters are actually clustered within 30 miles of Heathrow. All the boroughs which have got densest concentrations of multinationals are in the west, and then out down to Slough, Reading. You know the story. Don't fool around with all of that. It may be not the most optimal place to have an airport, I readily concede that, but we must invest and support the Davis inquiry, as I'm sure it comes up with a third and a fourth runway at Heathrow. Thirdly, keep open. This country must not close. And I think that in this debate about a lot of foreign money coming in to buy upmarket residential property, the argument should be not stop it, but actually how to ensure that actually we capture the benefits of it best whilst staying open. So those are my three don'ts. Don't leave the European Union, don't fool around with Heathrow, don't close. And here are my do's. These ecosystems of the type that we've got in London are, I believe, there's so many technologies, so much scientific advance, digitalization, nanotechnologies, robotization, medicine, the multiple areas in which the economic base of our country and Western advanced countries are going to be transformed over the decades ahead. The scope to make epic mistakes in your business model is huge. The cleverest and smartest companies are actually open innovators, open to influences from outside. That's what the Big Innovation Centre that I chair does and promulgates. We try to be a neutral space for people to kind of have cross-company and cross-sector conversations. And actually, what takes place in London with the connectivities that we have is multiple of those conversations take place with almost kind of spontaneously. But I think it would be helpful to be more self-conscious about what's taking place and to treasure it and to try and spur it. So, I'm all for more accelerators, more business accelerators, more open innovation institutes of the type that have been built with the catapults. Secondly, talk not just. I strongly support what Tony said, but I want to make. I have a slight kind of resile. And everyone knows my politics, but I slightly resile from public investment in this kind of rather statist language. The whole point about public investment is actually to think public-private codependencies. It's the codependency between public and private that we have to try to capture. Everyone knows in the room, and you'll come up with your own preferences as we open up the discussion about what you would spend investment monies on. But the reason why you want the strongest university sector possible is actually because it helps to drive the private sector. The reason why you invest in medical research is it helps to drive the private sector. There's this codependency between public and private in a capitalist economy, which actually is happening spontaneously in London without actually anyone having to do very much, except let's not screw it up by actually undernourishing the public parts of this public-private kind of codependency. And thirdly, and lastly, as a do, start worrying about inequality. The inequalities in London are breathtaking, and they will actually, we've got hutching, as the FT describes it, for lots of young people trying to get work in London. People, young, our kids, not, Romanian families and Benefit Street, but our kids are kind of 4, 5, 6 up in bedsits and flats around the place. Meanwhile, the super rich are kind of tunneling down to build kind of epic cinemas underneath their houses. And this process will not go on for long without there being some kind of social kickback, some social lashback. And actually one has to take care of that by preemptively doing something about it. That means being much smarter about property taxation than we are. I have my own ideas on that. We can open them up in discussion. But actually, inequality and the menace it poses to this fabulous city in which we live must be acknowledged, and we must take care of it. Thank you very much.
Will, thank you very much indeed. You had 3 do's, 3 don'ts. We had 1 vote where there was a poor gentleman who voted against everyone else. We didn't vote on your Heathrow proposal. So all those who would be in favour of not just keeping but extending the hub of Heathrow by adding a 3rd or a 4th runway, in favour of that, please? Against that, please? Okay. 80-20, I'd say that was.
No, it's 85-15, actually.
85-15.
Recount.
Some of them were voting with their cards. Let's go to Lord Adonis. Lord Adonis gave us a fantastic lecture on the infrastructure challenges of London, echoing Tony's earlier point that nothing ever comes of reviews. Andrew, what do you think is important in terms of investment, and what should we be doing next?
Well, I always thought as a member of the House of Lords that it was the most sensible and wise body in the country. But I think you're pretty good second best, actually, judging by those votes that we just had. And certainly they correspond with Will's do's and don'ts. Can I respond to what Tony said? Because what Howard Wilson famously said, the problem with royal commissions is that they take minutes and last years, and nothing happens, including on all of those subjects that we talked about we've talked about so far, notably airports. But I think Tony's report may be path-breaking. Now, Tony and I have been working together on projects for 25 years, and we started writing a book on the rise and fall of the poll tax, which you may remember, those of you who are slightly longer in the tooth, was probably, there was quite a long list of them. It's probably the single most inept thing that a government has done since the war. There are lots of other competitors, but that probably comes high on the list. And one of the very, very few reforms that the same government has both enacted and repealed because it proved to be so disastrous and collapsed. And when Tony and I were trying to fathom how it could conceivably have happened that a government could have committed itself to something so absolutely bonkers. The idea that somebody with no income in a bedsit in Hackney should be paying exactly the same level of tax as somebody with a multi-million-pound house in Belgravia. We started asking about precedents. Where did it come from? You know about the historical precedents, which of course are universally disastrous. Several monarchs lost their heads and livelihoods as a result of poll taxes. So we thought there must be some international precedent, we thought. And so we scoured for the international precedents. And we could only find one, which Tony may recall, was Guinea-Bissau, which had introduced a per-head tax. But there had been a revolution, and it was converted into a hut tax. And we thought this total failure to learn from precedents and international practice was just breathtaking, really. This idea that somehow, our only frame of reference is an internal frame of reference, and even there, not based on any real experience. And of course, it was exactly the same process of complete exceptionalism driven by political ideology that led to the abolition of the GLC and leaving London the only city of its size in the world without any proper system of government and all that. Now, the interesting thing about the last 20 years, in which Tony says that things have got so much better, and they manifestly have, as all of us Londoners know, is that we have at long last started learning the international lessons. We've established a proper system of city government with some proper planning powers. We've started to get the infrastructure sorted out. People like me 10 years ago talked about the impossibility of building significant infrastructure. Well, the Crossrail experience, which I want to come back to in a moment, but also the total renovation of London's public transport. Doubling of bus usage, huge extension of the bus network, massive investment in the Victorian and Edwardian tube, the first congestion charge of its type in the country. There has been really significant infrastructure planning, including new infrastructure investment, and of course in Canary Wharf, essentially the building of a new city within a city. And there's lots more like that going on too. I was in Earl's Court recently, 8,000 units going to be there. That's going to be a new town within the city. We talk about new towns outside London, and I'm a proponent of those. I think we need those for the wider needs of London and the South East, but actually policy is leading to the development of a cluster of new towns within London, which will be hugely significant in population and jobs terms. Now, the thing, though, about Tony's proposals, which I like, is, of course, far from being rooted in nothing except a kind of political whim, like the poll tax. They're rooted in serious international practice, and also crucially, because, of course, we don't like looking abroad, despite your vote earlier, on precedents that have worked here. And that's what I want to talk about in a very practical way, just for a few minutes. The great success in this area, in terms of investment in the last 10 years, is Crossrail. Crossrail is going to transform London transport capacity, a 10% increase in capacity, relentlessly focused on congestion busting east and west, transforming the capacity to link housing to the major employment markets in the centre. And it is a wholly innovative form of financing that's led to Crossrail, because it is not, in the way that Tony described, a traditional bid to the centre for the biggest and best that you can get and then see whether it happens. That, of course, was the process that previously applied to London transport investment, and indeed is what had led to, because in fact in this case it's so big that repeatedly it was cancelled. It was a kind of the inverse of Tony, because it was so big, but in fact so essential to drive this huge population and employment growth in London. Governments, even where they tentatively committed to it, then cancelled it. So Crossrail was cancelled 3 times. Maybe it was more. If you, I mean, in the tentative consensus given, but it was the full-blown Crossrail scheme was cancelled twice because it proved to be so big. Now, what then happened, and this is crucial, is that London's businesses, with a new London business representative body called London First, bringing all the business community together, itself started campaigning not only for Crossrail, but, and this is the crucial bit, which is almost a first in the history of taxation, started campaigning for the right for London businesses to pay a tax in order to make Crossrail possible. Now, that very rarely happens, in my experience. As a politician, I don't find, if I asked how many of you actually think the mansion tax is a good idea, I suspect I might get the inverse of the vote that we had earlier. But in my experience as a politician, it's not very often that people volunteer to pay new taxes. In the case of Crossrail, the London business community volunteered to pay a tax, provided, and this was the key proviso, that central government would actually, and the mayor, would actually commit to building Crossrail and then wouldn't cancel it afterwards. And so what you had was a highly innovative financial package, which was part central, part local, to finance Crossrail. You had what's called the supplementary business rate, which is larger businesses paying a significant tax, specifically to fund the development of Crossrail, and then with community infrastructure levy, business contributions, and other taxes, a significant additional local contribution too. So that something like, of the 16 billion cost of Crossrail, something like 4 billion is coming from London businesses and residents directly paying for the cost. Now, this was crucial, because not only did it make it viable in for central government to go ahead with it, but also, crucially, it made it very hard to cancel. It made it very hard to cancel, because the traditional model whereby the Treasury blows hot and cold on infrastructure spending, and particularly cold, of course, when there's austerity in the air, and the first thing it does is to cancel the first 5 or 6 big infrastructure projects. Remember the 1974 Labour government, when it came in, what are the first 2 things it cancelled? It cancelled the Channel Tunnel, and it cancelled the Maplin Airport. Those were 2 brilliant decisions in retrospect, weren't they? And this tends to be the case. Because London businesses were making so substantial a contribution to Crossrail, it was almost uncancelable. And so unusually for a big infrastructure project, it survived not only a change of regime in County Hall, or now City Hall as it is in London, but also a change of government. And it's now proceeding. It will open in 5 years' time, and it's being used as the precedent. Tony referred to the work that he and I have been doing on Crossrail 2 as a precedent for the north-south version of Crossrail, which will be equally transformational, another 10% increase in capacity, providing massive congestion relief to the southwest of London, which is whose transport connections with central London are congested at the moment and will simply become unsustainable in the mid to late 2020s, but also congestion busting a whole string of congested major London stations and termini, including Clapham Junction, Waterloo, Victoria, Euston, King's Cross, St Pancras, and not only connecting the northeast, but opening up huge development potential in the northeast, which is a prime site for new housing development in the Lee Valley, and bringing that within 15 minutes of central London. Now, the question, so there is a big precedent for what Tony said. The big precedent is Crossrail, and what Tony is essentially proposing, as I see it in practical terms, is that London will be able to keep a larger share of its property and business taxes in return for agreement with central government on 2 or 3 big priority infrastructure projects, which London itself is then prepared largely to pay for. And he and I have been working on the figures in respect of Crossrail too, and very neatly, the additional yield that you get from the Travers plan, in terms of the incremental growth in these taxes being kept by London, is roughly what you would need to make Crossrail 2 possible. But the big breakthrough in terms of the growth in London and the provision of the infrastructure that we're going to need for a city hurtling towards 10 million people, is that this time we will provide the infrastructure before and help to foster the growth, including the big equality issues that Will referred to, if this can be used as a vehicle for driving very significant housing growth, especially in development areas, rather than what's happened in London for the previous generation, which is that the infrastructure investment has almost entirely been catch-up. It's been after congestion crises, and then putting in place measures which relieve it afterwards. And I see the Travers proposals, if you're looking at Crossrail 2, because Crossrail 2 will happen, the issue with Crossrail 2 is whether it happens and is constructed in the 2020s, or the 2030s, or the 2040s. And being very practical about it, with the Travers plan, I think it's possible to do it in the 2020s, because London is paying for it up front, and it would then be a direct successor project to Crossrail, and it could be built alongside HS2. Wouldn't this be a wonderful case of actually joining up infrastructure projects, which of course is almost unheard of in the history of this country, but we sometimes do, learn some lessons from the French, the Germans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and others. It's just possible. It's just possible we might be able to do it. The difference if we do Travers is that we could do this in the 2020s. Also, we won't have disbanded all of these construction teams and project management teams and all that, which are just about to be disbanded after Crossrail. Will actually keep them on. And this big crisis we have as a nation, not having enough engineers and all that, partly because we don't have the long-term projects for them to work on and so on. We can deal with all of that. If we don't do it, what will happen is, in the traditional means of the centre, rather incompetently working out how it can catch up, will end up doing Crossrail much more expensively, much less value, and doing much less to bridge London's inequalities in the 2030s or the 2040s. So there's a very practical edge to Tony's proposals, particularly in respect of Crossrail 2. If I can just add 2 more points, being practical about it. London needs to be able to take charge of its destiny in terms of its tax base, and that's Tony's proposals, I think, are important there. However, it's also very important that decision makers in London actually allow Londoners to pay for things that they would willingly pay for if only the decision makers would stopping things happening that need to happen. Now, the 2 obvious ones are, first of all, airport expansion. Now, I need to choose my words carefully here, because we've got the Davis Commission, which is looking at a whole range of different options, and my party's policy is we will look very carefully at his report, and we aren't closing any options at all at the moment. But with that big caveat, wouldn't it be a great idea if you actually, because after all, this is largely, the credible options on the table, airport users will pay for. This is not the state which is going to be making the investment. What we are doing at the moment is the state is stopping Londoners and London businesses from paying for infrastructure that they would willingly pay for if only they were allowed to do so. The second one, which is much less well known, but I think is a really critical infrastructure issue facing London, and I think it's more critical the more I look about it, is crossings of the Thames in East London. Somebody said to me recently, Tony will know whether this is true, but it seems to me plausible, that if you stand on the Thames at Waterloo Bridge, looking over at Waterloo, and you turn right, average GDP, income per head, is 3 or 4 times the national average, looking, therefore, at West London. If you turn left and look at East London, it is below the national average for GDP. Now, where is going to...
It's Southwark Bridge, actually.
Maybe it's Southwark. Well, it'd be an interesting one to see. But maybe this is apocryphal, but it sounds brilliant, doesn't it? And clearly it does have a tinge of some truth to it. Now, where is the big new settlements and communities going to be? East London is going to have to play a crucial part in this. One of the biggest problems in building new housing and settlements in East London is you cannot get across the Thames. It's a whole series of island communities, which are islands because they're not connected up. You have whatever it is, 22 bridges, road bridges across the Thames in the 20 miles going west from Tower Bridge through to Kew, and you have precisely one going east, which is the Dartford crossing of the M25. And other than that, you're dependent on the Blackwall Tunnel, opened 1897, which has those big bends because horses would bolt if they could see the light at the end, and still has height restrictions, which mean you can't even get trucks through it. I mean, you couldn't make it up. This is one of the main arteries which are supposed to be keeping this world city going. Or you have the Rotherhithe Tunnel, which I think was opened 10 years later and has no capacity either. And I have to say, let me just make my one-party political remark. You do, and Londoners have a right to expect that their decision makers rise to the level of the challenges which are faced. The first decision which the current Mayor of London took was to cancel the Thames Gateway Bridge that would have linked Greenwich and Newham and provided a very high capacity road link between those two communities, opening the potential for tens of thousands of houses as well. In its place, we have a cable car which carries fewer people in a week than that bridge would have carried every 10 minutes, and on the last figures has 22 regular commuters. 22. These are people who use it more than apparently 3 times a week. Now, because Boris now realises he needs to raise his game, we now have a garden bridge. Now, I love the idea of a garden bridge where you can amble around and look at beautiful flora and fauna and all kinds of things there. How many trucks and cars will that carry across the Thames? Even fewer than the cable car, because apparently it's possible to take 2 bikes on each cable car, and it's not clear at the moment whether the bikes are going to be allowed across the Garden Bridge. Now, we do need to get real about this, and in something I'm publishing next week with the Centre for London, thinking about this really seriously, my proposal in there is that we need to set up a Thames Crossings Development Corporation, rather like the London Docklands Development Corporation that did Canary Wharf, specifically tasked with, over the next 10 years, designing, constructing and operating new crossings on the Thames. It looks to me as if we need 3. We need a new tunnel somewhere near the Blackwall Tunnel, roughly what Boris is proposing with the Silvertown Tunnel, but there's no proper plan for delivering that at the moment. We need the Thames Gateway Bridge, and we badly need the second Lower Thames crossing, which has been planned now for, again, 20 years to relieve the M25. And these are not marginal projects. These are absolutely core infrastructure projects that will unlock massive investment and, in particular, the potential for housing in East London. There you are.
Thank you. Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Okay, 2 quick votes then. Who thinks that a development corporation for bridges and tunnels for the east side of the Thames would be a good idea? All those in favour? All those against? Okay, right. We've seen who you are. We know where you live. Right. And who thinks that airport users should be enabled to pay for the expansion that the Davis Commission will recommend wherever it is? All those in favour? And all those against? Okay, it seems there's a lot of consensus here, Andrew. Thank you very much indeed.
It won't happen then, doesn't it? Yeah. far too obvious a thing if everybody agrees with it.
I'm failing miserably to control our brilliant speakers, and what I'm going to say to David and Julie is, please be as brief as you can, so that we can have some contributions from the audience, which is the key thing. David, you gave us a fantastic speech about employment, inclusion, the challenges in the London labour market, the nationalised system that wasn't working for London. Where do you think the investment is needed?
Right, well, 20 minutes later, I'll tell you. Just joking. I was going to do a few votes, but Greg, I'll leave that to you. I'd like a head count at the end as to who's going to be recruiting in the next year and who's not, just to get a feel. But the key message today is that since I gave the speech, I think it was last June, wow, London has really been roaring away. There were some very positive signs back last summer, but since then we've increased our employment rate 70%. in employment last summer, 71.4%. And we are now back at an employment rate which is just above pre-recession levels. So far as London is concerned, if you like, in terms of the labour market, at least recession is over. Whilst the southeast is still doing very well, actually they're still not quite back at pre-recession levels. So just in the last 3 years, you know, we've actually created 500,000 new workforce jobs in London, which is quite staggering actually, and that's almost twice the rate as the whole of the rest of the UK. But, and here's the but, London's economy is creating the jobs but squeezing the living standards of London's workers ever harder. So since 2009, the median pay across the UK has just been seen an increase of just 3%. In London, it's been 2%. And indeed, in 2013, in London, median pay did not shift at all. So on the one hand, we've got this large growth in jobs, positive, but on the negative side, that is actually being paid for by reducing wages all round. So Londoners are feeling the squeeze in living standards harder than elsewhere, but more of them are in work. But it's, of course, would be tempting, but totally inaccurate to say that the pain has been shared equally and that we've all been in it together. But unfortunately, of course, that is not true. So I'm just giving an example that take elementary jobs, you know, those jobs at the low end of the labour market, which are paid the least, have the lowest qualified working in them. Yeah, positive increase in jobs, again, 23% increase in jobs as compared to the London average of 21% increase in the last 3 years. But median pay has dropped 10% since 2009. That's the extent of the squeeze at the bottom end. And of course, at the same time, you know, qualifications. There is such a premium on qualifications in getting a job in London at the moment. Basically, now we have just tipped over, I think actually since last summer, when I was predicting that we'd trip over that half the people in work in London have got a degree. And so if you've got a degree, you're doing okay. If you've got 5 good GCSEs, okay, you're still doing about quits. If you're below that, if you're the lowest qualified, then your employment rate is very low indeed. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that we have just got too many people who are underemployed at the moment. The higher qualified people are competing for those low qualified jobs as well and pushing out those who would normally be expected to take those lower qualified jobs. Now, here's the big but. Despite all of that good news of growth in jobs, we still in London only stand 6th in the employment rate league out of the 9 English regions. Okay, our unemployment rate is still 8.1%, whereas nationally, of course, is 7.1%. And so only the northwest, the northeast, Yorkshire and Humberside have worse unemployment rates than ourselves. There still remains 200,000 JSA claimants. That's double of what we had in the pre-recession level. And the number of people on sickness benefits has barely changed at all. 300,000 across the capital. Half of those are on sickness benefit because of mental health reasons. But actually, rubbing in the bad news at the moment, young people haven't seemed to be faring any better with those increase in jobs. So the unemployment rate for young people in London is still standing at 20%. That's excluding students, and that's higher than the UK. And so basically, young people grow up to be older people, and at some point or other become embedded in the labour market. But in London, we are making the transition from education to work extremely traumatic for our young people. And for the lowest qualified young people, they are staying out of work for longer and longer and longer, and that adds that damaging, scarring effect that it has on their future careers. And at the same time, we need to still remember that 1 in 5 of all of our households in inner London are workless, and that 33%, that 1/3 of all of our children live in a household that is claiming a means-tested benefit. So look, this is still a tale of two cities. And what's more, the two cities are being driven apart. That polarisation is growing stronger. So what do we need to do about it? So very, very quickly. First of all, we really do need to be improving our skills and further education system to improve the qualification levels and vocational qualification, especially for those people at the low end of the labour market. There's been a good and dramatic increase in apprenticeships, but more of those have gone to older people. We need to be focusing London at younger people. And London companies need to be training their workforce more to improve employability, improve productivity, and improve the flexibility of the labour market overall. We need to be making work pay in London more. At the moment, still too many employers in London are being subsidised by benefit payments. By that, I mean tax credits. We need a renewed drive around London living wage, and that we need to wean off London businesses from the subsidy that you're getting through the tax credit system. We need to be improving the effectiveness of Job Centre Plus, programmes for the unemployed, like the work programme, which in general is just not performing sufficiently well. Lastly, and this is the abbreviated list, the state of careers advice in our schools, as well as in further education, is shocking, absolutely shocking. We are not providing, both to our young people or indeed to their parents, the right sort of information to take rational decisions about careers in London at the moment. And so how do we go about doing that? Well, I too, unsurprisingly given the panel, I guess, are in favour of devolution or greater powers down to London to determine, first of all, how the money to support unemployed people is spent, but also critically the devolving greater powers over skills funding, further education in London. But also I think we now need to start looking at how London can be setting its own statutory living wage or statutory London minimum wage, rather than staying in hock to the sort of lowest common denominator set by the Low Pay Commission across the whole country. But the challenge really to devolution when it comes to employment and skills, again I refer to an OECD report in this field, which again, unsurprisingly, found that yes, the UK had the most centralised system when it came to benefits, when it came to support for unemployed people, when it came to skills funding. But at the same time, it found that it had one of the most efficient systems as well. So if you like, the challenge for devolution is really showing how, if put in the hands of Londoners, we get better decisions around how we support the most disadvantaged groups in London and how we improve their position, and we don't get the crazy decisions like another cable car over the Thames. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. So who works for an employer who's going to be recruiting this year? If you do, raise your hand. If you don't, raise your hand. Okay, I'd call that 90-10. Yeah, would you agree with that, Will?
I thought I did 5-15.
Colleagues, we are going to bring you into the conversation after Julie's spoken, so get ready with your points and comments. We'll have to have a big round of contributions if I'm going to get you out of here by 10:45 and we've had a discussion. But we want to focus now on London's business districts, London's town centres, and Dr. Julie Grail's going to talk about what she thinks are the important focuses for investment and how that might happen. Julie, welcome.
Thank you, Greg, and no pressure, but I shall try and be as quick as possible. And I wanted to pick up a point that Will made first about the importance of public and private sector codependency, and that's a lot about really the three things I'm going to tell you about. So I'm talking to you about places, about managing places and why we have to manage them and what the issues are. And firstly, I want to talk about public policy and their expectations on private sector investment. Secondly, I want to talk about the private sector and its definition and its role in this. And thirdly, I want to just pick up some of the fairly obvious, but I think equally increasingly frustrating challenges on the public sector. So firstly, from a public policy point of view, and I won't re-rehearse it all, but we've heard so much over the last few years of the rhetoric of localism and sub-localism. And what does that really mean? And the Tories call it big society and the Lib Dems call it community politics. But what does it really mean on the ground? And what does it mean to us for sort of town centres and places? I think one of our challenges, and a cynic might say one of the issues of it, is the public sector purse is empty at local level, or at least very, very stretched, and therefore localism and sub-localism relying on the public sector is incredibly difficult to achieve, hence the need to ask someone else to pay. But the opportunities to fund services is increasingly being investigated in a variety of different ways. So business improvement districts, which is very much my kind of core discipline. The model has been in place now in the UK for nearly 10 years. I would say it's absolutely heralded as a great success in many respects. There are 173 bids across the country. A mandatory levy is on a commercial area or on a predefined area after a ballot of business. And as we heard earlier, you know, businesses do sometimes ask to pay. They do sometimes ask to be levied because they believe they can see the value coming back and it's a real business case that they invest in. But I think the bid model equally, it has its challenges and it's in danger of becoming a victim of its own success at the moment. And in particular, without being too government bashing myself, there is becoming a potential over-reliance on this levy model as being the panacea to a whole load of different things. And I named two in place terms. T-bids, tourism bids, which has come purely out of the gaping hole of tourism funding in government and the need to find another route to fund destination management organisations across the country. My view, I don't think they'll ever get off the ground. It's a very difficult thing to do, but the levy model is perceived as an easy thing to achieve. And I think more importantly for our places, because this kind of cuts across so many other issues, is the late night levy. It's there, it's introduced, it's coming into place in a number of different locations. And it's about a mechanism to capture money from the private sector to fund enormous cuts in policing. And on the face of that, theoretically, that might be okay. But at local level, it has all sorts of challenges. And it is in danger of losing the golden egg of the bid model that's already there, and in many ways charged to do part of that. So ultimately, there's a belief that the public sector can kind of encourage the private sector to pick up the slack. But can they, and will they? And if they do, what will it look like? So here's my second point, the private sector. It is one of my biggest bugbears that people talk about the private sector as one homogenous group. It couldn't be more different. when you talk about the private sector, and certainly when you talk about places and how you manage places, there are so many different layers of engagement with the private sector, and the way in which you do that and the ability and opportunity for leadership at local level changes dramatically from place to place. So style, willingness, ability, capacity of the private sector to engage is very, very different in different places. And we've seen varying degrees of business engagement in London over the last 2 or 3 decades. We've seen very large businesses, the example that we've heard a couple of times now about the investment in Crossrail, coming out of successful organisations like London First, capturing an issue at that level and having big business recognising that strategic lead. We've seen business sector organisations having some voice for some things with various degrees of success. But what we haven't really seen until the last decade is location-based partnerships and voices. And that's what we're beginning to see through the bid model. Varying successes in the past, I think. Outer London saw the development of town centre management from the mid-90s, very low-level voice and limited money. Central London generally saw regeneration-led activity, highly dependent on public money, but nevertheless creating some voice. But what we have now is bids, and we've had 10 years of bids. There are 37 bids across London. There are 7 further places actively developing them at the moment. Those 37 bids currently collect just in their bid levy alone over £21 million a year, and 11,000 businesses pay into those. So this is not insignificant anymore. In terms of kind of typology, and I could talk all day on this, but don't worry, Greg, I won't. I wanted to just kind of pick out 4 types really across London. So firstly, and not to kind of put them to one side, but it's a slightly different issue. There are 6 industrial bids. They're in industrial areas that tend to be a fairly straightforward voice, business voice with coordinated efforts. I think they're slightly different to the debate we're talking about here. There are then, though, importantly, 12 significant central London bids that have they've created for themselves a very strong and complex voice on a whole variety of strategic issues, and they leverage in large sums of money from a variety of different sources, and they are delivering effective services on the ground. But they're becoming quite a significant kind of power in their locality. And just a couple of examples of that before I move on. Heart of London, which was the first bid in central London, and has since added on a second bid to it. It's Leicester Square, Piccadilly Circus through Piccadilly. And it's very much focused, and always has been, on creating a voice that's about a vision for the area, inspiring leadership for the area, inspiring and very much attracting investment, long-term investment into the area. It's always been generated and kind of led by the property industry. It will be the first, I'm sure, to establish a property owner bid, which we're still trying to finalise the regulations with government for. And it's inspired a huge amount of investment because it's seen as a very safe and strong pair of management hands in a place, which actually, when places are not in single ownership and places have all this layering of public sector investment and responsibilities, you need to see that kind of cohesiveness that you can through a bid. And secondly, slightly different example, in Midtown, which is the Holborn patch right up to Centrepoint, because of the nature of their area, very different type of environment, predominantly corporate office occupiers, they have got that big business voice, but they've also been very much focused on the kind of office occupiers are king and it's those that pay their bills. And they've created this kind of innovative management model that says the things we do through having the mandate from you and through having the opportunity for joint buying create cash and carbon savings for this place and for those businesses that are funding it. They do have a strategic voice as well, but they see the opportunity to achieve economies of scale in a locality. The third kind of type that I want to pick up is those others that in central London that I haven't put in that significant category. So 6 other locations in central London, slightly smaller places, kind of effective delivery models with a coordinated voice, but certainly not on the scale that I've just described. And then there are 13 others, and they're outer London. Varying sizes, but essentially the traditional town centres, which actually you only have to say town centres or high streets to journalists at the moment, and you're an incredibly popular person, aren't you? These are the places that everybody is scratching their head over. What do we do with these places that are kind of crumbling? And historically, these places have been about janitorial management of the place, increasingly promoting the location as a destination, but now more so, increasingly moving towards place shaping of that location and a leadership role. And I think one of the challenges we've had, and we still have in these locations, and this is this private sector issue, business engagement in these locations it's actually incredibly challenging because the vast majority, and I think I'll do the 85-15 in this one, the vast majority of those businesses in those locations, because of the bid model being on occupiers, are merely a fascia with a caretaker manager with no local leadership, no autonomy in decision making, and only focused on driving here and now, today and tomorrow, footfall and reducing operating costs. So it's very difficult to drive the long-term investment decisions and the long-term kind of leadership in there. But it's increasingly beginning to happen. And just an example I want to just pick up here is Kingston First, the longest established bid. It's been established in terms of partnership for 20 odd years. It's been a bid for 9.5 years. It's a very mature model now, balancing between the here and nows of all the delivery of janitorial, destination marketing, etc., and moving on to real kind of focus on place shaping. But more than that, it's been, I think, probably in the bid world at the moment, the only real example of kind of sub-localism in action, where they, as a partnership, the broader partnership, have all been bold enough and brave enough to trial this concept of transferring the responsibility and delivery of council services, local services, into the bid model. I can't tell you every single bit of it's worked brilliantly, but actually most of it is pretty good. And the principle is, why shouldn't a business-led entrepreneurial management vehicle that actually understands and cares about this place much more deliver those things versus a bureaucratic and slightly cumbersome and hands tied behind their back local authority that is never really focused on the kind of issues of the day. That's my second sin. So I can't come on to the third thing, which is, but what are the challenges of the public sector? And here's this issue about codependency. Bids are delivering so much and have the potential to deliver so more, but what we're seeing in these places, whilst this is going on, is rapidly deteriorating street services in these places. The basic clean function that a civilised Western country should be able to achieve are no longer there. They're not guaranteed at all. Reduced policing provision, which is a significant problem now for a whole host of society's reasons. And there are really obvious gaps in police presence within commercial areas and an expectation that someone else can pick up that bill. And it's just not as easy as that. It's perceived that, the crime to a person is much more a higher priority than crime to a business. But actually, it's much more complex than that. Thirdly, and I use this advisedly in micro rather than macro level, crumbling infrastructure is so noticeable in our town centres and particularly in those that are out of London. The very basic principles of a street lighting contract ensuring that street lights are on in a town centre no longer exists. The ability to manage parks no longer exists. You just keep it reasonably safe and sometimes you just lock the gate because that's easier. Basic street furniture maintenance doesn't really happen anymore. There's an expectation someone else will now pay for that if it matters to them. And I think as a result of all that, we've got this slightly kind of sad situation that the sense of responsibility for kind of place management from a local authority perspective is now waning because they're kind of powerless to act. They've got no money and they need somebody else to work for them. So where does that all leave us? And can bids and business kind of organisations pick up some of the slack? And I'm nearly there, Greg, don't worry. I think the answer is possibly yes. Certainly, true place management needs a variety of things. It needs leadership, it needs mandate, it needs power, influence, most importantly, it needs money. Bids has a bit of all of those, and in some cases a lot of all of those. But it can go further. And I think rather than seeing this kind of piecemeal development and lack of recognition of that codependency on public sector facilitation, enabling and investment, and the bit that the private sector can do better and pick up. We have to be able to see kind of the bigger picture. And I think a couple of final things to say, really. For London, it's interesting. Now, given the local authority situation is very, very different between us and New York, so it's not necessarily a fair comparison, but Mayor Bloomberg has just resided over New York's 68 bids for the last decade, with his office having an amazing degree of understanding and knowledge of every single location, the value that those put into the place, and the ability to deliver at a whole load of different sectors and activities within that place. I'm afraid we are nowhere near that in London. And I think, finally, seeing this kind of opportunity for localism and taking it further is a great opportunity if we do it well. Transferring services into organisations that could do better is great, but we must see powers come across and we must see that codependency. It's not public sector drop it and private sector pick it up, because it just doesn't work like that. Thank you.
Julie, thank you very much.